A dog saved a child's life on April 18, 2025. 47 days later, a court ordered him euthanized. At 9:12 a.m. on June 3rd, an 11-year-old girl stood in a Virginia courtroom while adults debated whether her dog deserved to live. She wasn't asking for sympathy. She wasn't asking for special treatment. She was asking one question: did anyone actually see what happened? But the paperwork had already been filed. The incident had already been labeled. The recommendation had already been written. Dangerous animal. At 9:47 a.m., Atlas was placed in the back of a white animal control van. No delay, no reconsideration, no second hearing. The door shut. Case moving forward. Emily stood on the courthouse steps holding an empty leash while strangers recorded the moment on their phones. Atlas didn't bark. Didn't struggle. He simply placed his paw against the metal gate and looked at her. That look would matter later. Because what no one in that courtroom knew, not the judge, not the prosecutor, not the man who accused him, was this: 9 days later, inside the very facility meant to confine him, a fire would break out, and the same dog labeled a public threat would run towards smoke instead of away from it. By June 12th, the court would be forced to reopen the case. The man who demanded Atlas be put down would stand face to face with that 11-year-old girl, and he would say 3 words no one expected: "I was wrong." This isn't just a story about a dog. It's about how fast fear can destroy the truth, and what happens when the truth fights back. Stay with us. Because what happened between June 3rd and June 12th didn't just save a dog. It exposed the system that almost killed him. At exactly 9:12 a.m., Fairview District Court looked like it always did: clean benches, sealed files, quiet order. But the air felt wrong for June, not because of weather. Because of what was about to be decided in minutes. Emily Collins stood at the front with Atlas beside her, the leash looped tight around her wrist like it was the only thing keeping her steady. Her fingers stayed buried in his fur, gripping as if her hands could rewrite whatever was written on paper. She didn't look toward the gallery where whispers started and stopped. She didn't look at the prosecutor's table stacked with printed photos and incident notes. She kept her eyes on Judge Lawson, because the judge was the only person in the room who could slow time down. "Please," Emily said, and the word came out smaller than she intended. "He's not dangerous." The clerk read the petition the way clerks read everything: flat, practiced, emotionless. Threat to public safety. Incident involving a minor. Recommendation: euthanasia pending review. The words landed like stamps. Not opinions, not questions. Stamps. Emily flinched at the word euthanasia even though nobody raised their voice. Atlas stayed still, ears forward, watching Emily like he was waiting for her next cue. Judge Lawson's expression did not shift. The judge didn't need anger to sound final. She only needed procedure. "Animal control will take possession effective immediately," she said. Immediately. No week, no delay. No time for Emily to prove what she already knew. By 147 a.m., they were outside. The courthouse steps were crowded in that casual way crowds get when they sense drama. A few reporters lingered near the curb. A couple of people held phones low, recording without saying they were recording. The animal control van waited with its engine, running like it had been scheduled. Emily wrapped both arms around Atlas's neck. She didn't care who saw her shake. She didn't care if she looked childish. "He's not dangerous," she cried, louder now, desperate now, because the decision had already been made and volume felt like the only weapon she had left. An officer approached carefully, not rough, not cruel, but firm. He eased her back inch by inch until her arms slipped away from Atlas's fur. The van door shut with a metallic thud that sounded bigger than it should have. Atlas didn't bark, didn't pull. He stepped forward as if he trusted the system the way he trusted Emily. As the van started moving, he pressed one paw against the grated window and looked straight at her. No panic, no rage, just trust. And that trust broke her as the van turned the corner and left her standing alone with an empty leash in her hand. The hospital room in 2022 smelled like disinfectant, warm plastic, and the kind of quiet that comes when people are trying not to scare a child. Claire Collins looked smaller than Emily remembered from before the sickness. Her skin had that pale, tired look that didn't match the afternoon sun pushing through half-closed blinds. Machines made soft, steady sounds, the kind nurses stop hearing but kids never forget. Emily was 8. She sat in a chair that felt too big, feet dangling, hands clenched in her lap because she didn't know where else to put them. Atlas lay beside the bed, chin resting near the edge of the mattress like he had assigned himself a job. A nurse had tried to explain rules once. "Most dogs can't come in here," she said gently. But Atlas had refused to leave the parking lot the first day. He wouldn't eat when Emily's uncle offered him food. He wouldn't drink when someone slid a bowl toward him. He kept crying until someone higher up finally said yes, just this once, because the dog's stubbornness was louder than policy. Claire watched Atlas with a tired smile that still looked like her. She reached for Emily's hair and smoothed it back with weak fingers. Her hand shook, but her voice tried not to. "No matter what happens," Claire whispered, close enough that only Emily could hear, "Atlas will always protect you." Emily nodded, because that's what kids do when they don't want to make things worse. Tears slid down her cheeks without sound. Atlas lifted his head and placed it on Emily's lap, heavy and steady, like a promise you could actually touch. For 3 days he barely moved from Claire's bedside. Nurses brought water. He didn't take it unless Emily held the bowl. When Emily stood up to use the restroom, Atlas stood too. When Emily sat back down, Atlas returned to the same spot, as if he believed that if he guarded the room hard enough, nothing bad could happen inside it. When Claire passed, there was no dramatic moment, no speech, just a nurse closing a curtain and an adult saying Emily's name too softly. Atlas didn't bark, he didn't panic. He pressed his body against Emily's side and stayed there while the world changed. After that, Atlas became routine in a way that felt like survival. He slept outside Emily's bedroom door every night, not because anyone trained him, but because he decided that door mattered. He walked her to the bus stop like it was a patrol route. He sat beside her during homework like he understood the difference between noise and focus. When Emily cried into her pillow, Atlas didn't fix it. He just stayed close until it passed. So when the court called him dangerous, it didn't feel like a label. It felt like someone was trying to rewrite her mother's last words. Losing Atlas wouldn't just be losing a pet. It would be losing the last living proof that her mom's promise had been real. And Emily wasn't ready to lose her twice. April 18, 2025. Lincoln Park, 3:42 p.m. The weather was the kind that makes people loosen their grip on caution. Parents sat on benches half watching, half scrolling. Kids moved between the slide, the swings, and the sidewalk like the whole place belonged to them. The street next to the park carried normal traffic, nothing that looked like danger until it was. Emily stood near the walkway with Atlas on his leash. He wasn't pacing. He wasn't barking. He was calm in the way that made Emily trust him without thinking. She adjusted her grip on the leash and watched the playground like she always did, not because she was nervous, but because Atlas's presence had taught her what alert could look like without fear. Across the path, Mason Grady, 6 years old, climbed down from the slide and started running toward his father. His hoodie bounced as he ran. His sneakers slapped the pavement in fast little steps. "Mr." Grady turned slightly, like he was about to say something, like he was going to meet him halfway. Then the timing went wrong. A red pickup turned too fast onto Lincoln Avenue. The driver's head dipped for a second, just long enough to glance at a phone. The truck didn't slow the way it should have near a park. It came through with that steady, careless speed that only looks normal until you realize a child is near a curb. Mason's foot slipped off the edge. It was small. It was silent. It was the kind of mistake kids make every day. He stepped into the street. From Emily's angle, she saw a boy running. From Atlas's angle, he saw a moving threat and a small body in the wrong place. The leash snapped tight as Atlas lunged. Emily's hand jerked. The loop slid against her wrist, and for a split second she tried to hold on with strength instead of sense. But Atlas's momentum wasn't aggression. It was urgency. Gasps burst from the benches. Someone stood up fast enough to knock their drink over. Another person raised a phone automatically, because shock now comes with recording. Atlas reached Mason and grabbed the sleeve of the hoodie. Not skin, fabric. He yanked Mason backward hard, using the only tool he had, his mouth and his weight. Mason fell onto the pavement, elbow scraping rough concrete. He screamed instantly, because pain is loud and fear is louder when you're 6. The red pickup blew past the spot where Mason's feet had been. It missed him by less than 3 feet. But the crowd didn't track the full sequence. They tracked what their eyes could process first: a big German shepherd pulling a child down. Mr. Grady ran forward and scooped Mason up, face tight, breath sharp, hands shaking in a way that looked like anger but was really adrenaline and guilt mixed together. "He attacked him!" someone shouted, and that sentence became a shortcut for everyone who needed a simple story. Police arrived after the moment had already been edited by panic. The videos that circulated showed Atlas's teeth against fabric. They didn't show the truck clearly. They didn't show the curb step. They didn't show the 3-foot margin that could have become a funeral. In court later, Mr. Grady said Mason needed stitches. He wasn't lying. Blood was real. But he didn't say the other truth out loud, that he had frozen for a second when the truck came. And in that second, a dog moved faster than a father. Emily replayed it at night like a loop. She couldn't turn off the red blur, the scream, the yank, the gap nobody talked about. She knew what Atlas had done, but she was learning something adults rarely admit. Truth doesn't always win first. Sometimes it has to survive fear long enough to be heard. June 6, 2025, 30:18 p.m. Arlington Animal Control Facility didn't look cruel from the outside. It looked official, a plain building with posted hours, a front desk, and signs about safety. Inside, the air smelled like disinfectant and stress. The hallway echoed because metal cages don't absorb sound, they throw it back at you. Barking came in uneven bursts, like a room full of alarms that never sensed. Atlas sat in his kennel with his posture straight, eyes tracking movement without reacting to it. Since arriving, he hadn't acted like what the paperwork called him. No lunging, no snapping, no chaos. Just a quiet watchfulness that made some staff uncomfortable because they expected fear or aggression and got neither. Emily visited every day after school. She came with her backpack still on, hair slightly messy, cheeks pink from rushing. She brought his blue tennis ball and held it up like a familiar signal. She read to him through the bars, sometimes from a book, sometimes from printed pages her aunt helped her type for the appeal. She spoke softly because she didn't want to excite the other dogs, and because part of her still believed that if she stayed calm, Atlas would feel it. That afternoon, she pressed her forehead to the metal, eyes closing for 1 second. "I'm fixing this," she whispered. "I promise." Atlas stepped forward and touched his nose to her fingers through the gap. No show. No drama. Just contact. Then a sharp pop came from deeper in the building. It wasn't loud enough to make everyone jump. It was the kind of sound older buildings make and people ignore. A thin thread of smoke followed, almost invisible at first, slipping along the ceiling near the storage wing where cardboard boxes and old supplies were stacked too close to a back wall. The fire alarm didn't trigger. The wire behind old shelving had failed, and the first smoke didn't hit a sensor the way it was supposed to. A staff member coughed once and waved a hand in front of their face, assuming dust. Someone else walked past the corridor and didn't notice the heat building behind insulation. Atlas noticed. His ears lifted. His breathing changed. He stood, head angled toward the smell like he was reading information nobody else had access to. Other dogs started barking, not because they saw flames, but because they sensed wrongness spreading. Emily pulled back from the kennel bars, suddenly alert. "Something's burning," she said to the nearest staff member. The staff member started to respond, but the smoke thickened fast, turning from a thin line into a ceiling, level cloud that pushed down into the hallway. In the back section, a kennel door had jammed earlier that day. 2 smaller shelter dogs were trapped behind it. A staff member ran toward them, tried the latch, yanked hard, then coughed again, deep this time, before dropping to one knee. Smoke doesn't ask permission. It takes your breath and your balance and your choices. Near Atlas's corridor, an emergency exit door had been propped open for ventilation. Atlas could have run. A clear path was right there. Instead, he turned toward the smoke. He drove his shoulder into his kennel latch once. Twice, the metal strained. On the third hit, something gave way. The door snapped open. Freedom was one direction. Danger was the other. Atlas chose danger without hesitating, and the building that was supposed to prove he was a threat was about to produce the proof that everyone had missed. The smoke thickened fast enough to change the building's sound. Barking turned sharper, metal rattled as dogs threw weight against doors. The hallway lights stayed on, but visibility dropped because smoke doesn't need darkness to blind you. It just needs time. Atlas stepped into the corridor low to the ground, moving the way animals move when air becomes unsafe. Heat pressed along the walls. His fur caught the smell of melting plastic and burning cardboard. He coughed once, then kept going. The open exit behind him showed a bright strip of daylight, clean air, and escape. He looked at it for half a second. Then he looked back toward the storage wing where the smoke was densest. A staff member lay near the storage entrance, collapsed on the tile. One arm was tucked strangely beneath her, her radio crackling with static that nobody was answering. Atlas reached her and nudged her sleeve with his nose. No response. He nudged again, firmer, still nothing. The fire behind the storage door flared, feeding on insulation and packaging. The heat surged in a wave that made the air shimmer. Atlas grabbed the fabric of the staff member's sleeve in his teeth. The same method everyone had judged in the park. The same grip, fabric not flesh. He pulled. Her body shifted an inch, then another, scraping slightly over the tile. Atlas adjusted his stance and pulled again, using his shoulders and weight. The smoke burned his throat. He coughed harder this time, but he didn't release. He dragged her out of the worst pocket of smoke, inch by inch, into the corridor closer to the open exit. Down the hallway, two smaller dogs cried from behind the jammed kennel door. Their voices were high and frantic, the kind that makes humans move faster, if humans can still breathe. Atlas paused with the staff member's sleeve still in his mouth. He turned his head toward the trapped dogs, ears forward, reading the distance. He released the sleeve and moved toward the jammed kennel. The latch wouldn't give. Atlas scratched at it, then hit it with his shoulder, but it was reinforced and stuck. He barked one sharp, directed bark, then barked again, louder, not a panic bark but a signal bark. Outside, someone had finally noticed smoke seeping from a side vent. A 911 call came in late, but it came in. Sirens began approaching, faint at first, then closer, slicing through the barking and the alarm that still hadn't triggered properly. A firefighter entered through a side door wearing full gear, scanning the corridor through haze. He couldn't see far, but he could hear. Atlas barked again toward the trapped kennel, then stepped back and barked once more, holding position like a pointer. "Back here!" the firefighter shouted, following the sound. Another firefighter moved in behind him with tools. They forced the jammed kennel open, hands fast, movements practiced. The two smaller dogs were lifted out, coughing, trembling, alive. Atlas didn't wait for praise. He turned immediately back toward the staff member. He returned to her sleeve and took the fabric again, dragging her farther, closer to the exit where the air was less poisonous. The tile near the doorway felt cooler. The smoke thinned slightly in that zone, giving the firefighters a clearer view. When they reached the staff member, they found Atlas still there, standing over her shoulder, nudging her face gently as if he expected her to wake up if he insisted hard enough. His muzzle was streaked with soot. His eyes were wide but steady. No growling, no frantic snapping, just focus. Paramedics took over, pulling the staff member onto a stretcher, fitting an oxygen mask over her face. One firefighter tried to guide Atlas out with a hand gesture, but Atlas didn't bolt. He walked alongside them willingly, staying close enough that Emily, who had been pushed outside during the evacuation, could see him through the open doorway. Emily's hands shook as she watched. Her dog, the one labeled a public threat, had just done the same thing twice in 2 months, reacted faster than people when seconds mattered. Later, when the staff member finally coughed and opened her eyes in the ambulance bay, she turned her head weakly and saw Atlas sitting nearby under a firefighter's watch. He wasn't fighting. He wasn't acting wild. He just sat there, suit covered, waiting like he had been waiting for Emily in court. The same jaws the system had called dangerous were the reason someone was breathing. And the building that was meant to contain him had become the place that revealed the truth in full. By the next morning, the Arlington Animal Control Facility had become something it had never been before, a crime scene of a different kind. Not of violence, but of evidence. Fire investigators arrived before sunrise, their flashlights cutting through the lingering smell of smoke and ash that clung to every wall. They moved carefully through the damaged corridor, photographing debris, measuring burn patterns, and cataloging every detail that the fire had left behind. And then, almost by instinct, One investigator turned toward the security camera mounted in the corner of the ceiling and realized that the entire night had been recorded. Every second of it. Every choice Atlas had made was preserved on hard drive footage, waiting quietly to be seen. The facility manager pulled the recordings into a review room, and what unfolded on that monitor shifted everything. Camera 3, positioned above the central kennel corridor, showed Atlas breaking his own enclosure door. The footage was grainy but unmistakable. He slammed his body against the latch with deliberate force, once, twice, 3 times, until the hinge buckled and the door swung open. He didn't bolt for the exit. He paused, ears up, nose working, and then turned directly toward the smoke. Camera 5 picked him up next inside the storage wing corridor, grabbing the sleeve of the unconscious staff member and dragging her inch by inch toward the hallway. The fire behind the storage door was already climbing the wall insulation, the heat visible even on the recording. He coughed, stumbled slightly, and kept pulling. Camera 7 captured him barking toward the trapped kennel, his body angled precisely toward the jammed door, his bark sharp and rhythmic, as if he knew exactly what volume and direction would carry to a human ear. When the firefighter entered through the side door, that bark is what guided him. The investigators sat in silence for a long moment after the footage ended. One of them finally said quietly, and never tried to leave. But the footage that truly unraveled everything came from an entirely unexpected source. A local news reporter, following up on the fire rescue story that had begun circulating online, submitted a formal request to the City Traffic Authority for exterior camera footage from Lincoln Avenue. The request was approved within hours because the story had already caught too much public attention to ignore. When the footage arrived and was slowed down frame by frame, the room where it was viewed seemed to hold its collective breath. Mason stepping off the curb was visible. The red pickup truck entering the intersection at speed was visible. Atlas lunging from the sidewalk, grabbing the sleeve of the child's hoodie, and pulling him backward onto the pavement was visible. And then the most important detail of all was visible, the truck passing through exactly the spot where Mason had been standing, missing him by less than 3 feet. The child's fall, the scrape, the crying, all of it happened after the danger had already passed. Atlas had not attacked a child. He had snatched a child away from the path of a speeding truck faster than anyone else in that park had even processed what was happening. The footage played in courtroom silence days later, projected onto a large screen in front of Judge Lawson, the prosecutor, and a gallery that had once whispered condemnation. When the truck blurred across the screen, someone in the back row gasped audibly. The prosecutor cleared his throat but said nothing. Animal control representatives shifted in their seats. Judge Lawson leaned forward with an expression that had changed completely from the day she had ordered Atlas removed. On the screen, the same grip was visible as in the fire, the same pull, the same speed, not aggression, not unpredictability, intervention, pure calculated instinctive protection. Atlas sat calmly beside Emily in the courtroom that day, his posture relaxed, his eyes forward. He didn't understand why the room felt different. He didn't understand that the screen above him was replaying the moments that would save his life. He had simply done what he always did. He had protected. The unconscious staff member from the facility, whose name was Dana Reyes, testified later that same week. Her voice was quiet and shaking as she described waking up near the facility exit with Atlas beside her, his nose pressed gently against her hand, still nudging her as if urging her to breathe. "When I opened my eyes," she said, "it was right there. He hadn't left me." Public headlines that had once read, "Dangerous Dog Pending Review," began shifting overnight. The narrative that had condemned him on incomplete information was unraveling with every frame of footage, every testimony, every detail that truth had patiently preserved. It had been there all along. It simply needed to be seen in full. By the end of that week, the story had traveled far beyond Fairview. National news outlets picked it up on Thursday morning, and by Thursday evening it had crossed into international feeds. The footage from Camera 5, Atlas dragging Dana Reyes through a smoke-filled corridor, had been shared hundreds of thousands of times across social media platforms. The traffic camera clip from Lincoln Avenue, showing the truck and Mason and Atlas's lunge, had been slowed down and replayed in countless video threads, with people pausing it frame by frame and pointing out exactly what the original witnesses at the park had missed in the chaos of the moment. The comment sections, which had once been filled with anger and fear directed at a dog labeled dangerous, began filling instead with disbelief, then admiration, then something that felt like collective guilt. People who had signed earlier petitions demanding Atlas be euthanized quietly deleted their comments. Others posted apologies publicly, not to any person in particular, but to the story itself, as if saying sorry to the truth they had dismissed too quickly. Firefighters from the Arlington station posted a group photograph on the department's official page. They were standing beside the rescue truck, and Atlas was sitting calmly in the center of the group, his fur still faintly darkened from smoke. The caption read simply, "He went back in." That photograph was shared over 200,000 times in a single day. Paramedics who had responded to a separate call in 2023 came forward with a report confirming that Atlas had alerted a neighbor by scratching at their door during an asthma attack Emily had suffered alone at home. The neighbor had called emergency services in time. That report had never been filed formally enough to matter before. Now it mattered enormously. Community memory began surfacing in waves. A woman from Emily's neighborhood posted that she had watched Atlas sit outside the pharmacy for 40 minutes one afternoon when Emily had gone in for medication, refusing to move from the spot until she came back out. Another person shared that Atlas had once herded a group of young children away from a storm drain that had flooded during heavy rain, barking and circling until an adult came. These were small stories, quietly lived, never reported. But now people remembered them and put them together into a picture of a dog who had spent years doing exactly what he had done in that park and in that burning building, protecting without being asked, acting without being rewarded. A petition demanding the immediate reversal of Atlas's euthanasia order gathered over 50,000 signatures within 48 hours. Legal advocates for animal rights contacted Emily's family offering pro bono representation. Local council members made public statements calling for a review of the procedures that had led to such a rapid condemnation. Animal Control released a statement acknowledging that the initial assessment had been conducted under time pressure with incomplete evidence, language that stopped short of a direct apology but acknowledged, unmistakably, that a mistake had been made. Mr. Grady watched the fire footage alone in his living room one evening after Mason had gone to bed. He sat in the blue light of his television and played the park clip 3 times. He watched the truck. He watched his son's small sneakers slip off the curb. He watched himself in the background of the frame, frozen for one critical second. His body turned at an angle that made it clear he had not yet registered the danger. And he watched Atlas react before he himself had moved a single step. He did not speak for a long time after the screen went dark. The guilt he had been suppressing beneath a wall of defensive anger finally broke through, and he sat with it quietly, the way a man sits with something he knows he must eventually face. He didn't call anyone that night. He didn't post anything online, but something in him shifted in that living room, something that would only become visible days later on the courthouse steps. Judge Lawson, reviewing the petition and the new evidence formally submitted to her chambers, issued an emergency order for a review hearing. Her written statement said, "The court must consider material evidence not available at the time of the original ruling." The language was procedural and precise, as legal language always is, but something in the phrasing carried a weight beyond procedure. The system that had moved so swiftly to remove Atlas was now slowing itself down, turning its own machinery around, being forced by truth and public conscience to examine what it had concluded in haste. For the first time since June 3rd, when the white animal control van had driven away with Atlas and left Emily standing alone on the courthouse steps, hope entered the courtroom before fear did. June 12th arrived with clear skies and warm morning light that felt almost deliberate, as if the season itself had decided to cooperate with what was about to happen. Emily woke early, before her alarm, and lay still for a moment in the quiet of her room. Atlas was not beside her yet, but he would be today. That thought alone made her chest tighten with something that was not quite hope and not quite fear, but lived in the exact space between the two. She dressed carefully, brushed her hair, and stood for a moment in front of her mirror. She looked older than 11 somehow, in the way that children look older after they have carried something too heavy for too long. She pressed her hand flat against the mirror for 1 second, breathed, and then went downstairs. The courthouse at 5 in the morning felt different from the way it had felt on June 3rd. The same polished wooden benches, the same American flag standing stiff beside the judge's platform, the same tall windows letting in clear light. But the air inside carried a different quality. Less whispering, less of the cold, clinical judgment that had pressed down on Emily's shoulders the first time she had stood here. The gallery was fuller than before, and the faces in it were leaning forward with curiosity rather than settled certainty. People had come not to confirm a conclusion, but to witness a correction. Atlas sat beside Emily at the front of the courtroom, not restrained tightly, not held with tension, simply seated with the quiet composure that had defined him from the very beginning. His posture was steady and calm. He looked ahead without nervousness, without aggression, without any of the qualities that had once been falsely attributed to him. Judge Lawson entered and the room rose. When she sat and folded her hands on the bench, she took a moment before speaking, looking down at the documentation in front of her with the measured seriousness of someone who understood the full weight of what she was about to say. She reviewed the new evidence aloud, not as a formality but as a deliberate act of public acknowledgement. The traffic camera footage, the fire rescue documentation from Arlington facility, Dana Rice's testimony, the veterinary behavioral evaluation conducted by a certified animal behaviorist who had spent 3 sessions observing Atlas and concluded, unambiguously, that he displayed no indicators of aggression and every indicator of protective bonding. Judge Lawson read each piece slowly, letting each one settle in the room before moving to the next. When she finished, she folded her hands and looked up. This court recognizes that prior conclusions were made without full context. The room was completely silent. The evidence now clearly demonstrates that Atlas acted in protection, not aggression. Emily's fingers tightened gently in his fur, but she did not make a sound. She had promised herself she would stay still. Atlas is not a threat to public safety. The words reached her like something physical, landing against her chest with a warmth she had not felt in weeks. He is, in fact, a demonstrated rescue animal whose actions on 2 separate occasions reflect a consistent pattern of protective behavior directed toward preserving human life. A murmur moved through the gallery, not loud, not disruptive, but real, the sound of a room adjusting its understanding. Judge Lawson paused once more before adding quietly, in a tone that felt less like a ruling and more like a reflection, sometimes bravery doesn't bark for attention. It simply acts. Even the prosecutor lowered his eyes with something that looked like respect. Animal Control formally withdrew the euthanasia petition from the record. The documentation was signed, dated, and sealed. It was over. But then, before the gavel could fall and the moment could close, the fire department chief rose from his seat in the gallery. He did not have a prepared speech. He spoke plainly and directly, the way firefighters tend to speak. His department, he said, would like to formally offer Atlas enrollment in their community search and rescue certification program. The room absorbed this for a second before the gallery responded with the first truly audible reaction of the entire hearing, not applause exactly, but something warmer, a collective exhale of recognition. The dog who had been brought to this courtroom under a euthanasia order was now being invited to serve the community that had nearly condemned him. Emily covered her mouth with both hands and felt tears spill freely for the first time all morning. Justice had not simply corrected itself. It had transformed into something that looked, in the clear June light of that courtroom, remarkably like grace. The courthouse steps were warm in the noon sun. Most of the reporters had dispersed after the ruling, moving toward their vehicles with phones pressed to their ears, already dictating headlines. The crowd that had gathered outside had begun to thin, breaking apart into smaller groups that drifted toward the parking lot with the quiet satisfaction of people who had witnessed something worth witnessing. Emily sat on the wide stone steps with Atlas beside her, his shoulder pressed against her leg, his eyes moving slowly across the open space the way they always did, alert, gentle, present. She hadn't spoken much since the ruling. There was too much inside her to organize into words yet, too much relief and too much grief, and too many weeks of fear all loosening at once in a way that needed time more than language. She was looking down at her shoes when she heard footsteps approaching. Not the brisk, purposeful steps of someone with somewhere to be, but slower ones, deliberate in the way that a person walks when they are making themselves go somewhere they are not sure they deserve to be. She looked up. Mr. Grady was crossing the courthouse plaza toward her, and Mason was walking beside him, small and quiet, one hand tucked into his father's. Mr. Grady was not wearing his courtroom expression anymore. His sunglasses were off and held loosely at his side, and his eyes were red in the way that eyes get when someone has not slept well for many nights in a row. He stopped a few feet from the steps and looked at Emily directly, not at the reporters, not at the camera that one lingering journalist still held, not at the ground in the apologetic way of someone performing humility. He looked at her. "I owe you an apology," he said. His voice was low, and it carried the particular roughness of someone who had rehearsed words many times, and then discarded all of them at the last moment. "Not to anyone else. To you." Emily held still. Atlas turned his head toward Mr. Grady, but did not move from her side. "I saw the footage," Mr. Grady continued, his jaw working slightly as he found the words. "I watched it 3 times, and I saw myself in it. I saw that I froze." He paused, and the pause was long enough that the ambient sound of the city came back in around the edges. A distant car, a bird somewhere in the decorative trees along the plaza. For just a second, I didn't move. And when Mason fell and started crying, it was easier to be angry at your dog than to sit with the fact that I hesitated when my son needed me to act. His voice cracked on the last word, not dramatically, but in the quiet way that genuine emotion breaks through when someone finally stops managing it. Emily looked at him for a long moment without speaking. There was something she had wanted to say to him for weeks, not in anger but in the exhausted weight of someone who had carried an injustice long enough that the only release left was honesty. But before she could find the words, Mason stepped forward. He had been standing slightly behind his father, watching Atlas with the wide, careful eyes of a child who had been told one version of a story and was now standing in front of a different version, trying to reconcile them. He looked at Atlas for a long time, and Atlas looked back at him with the same patient stillness he brought to everything. Then Mason walked the last few steps between them and put his small arms around Atlas's neck. He pressed his face gently into the German shepherd's fur, and his voice came out muffled and honest in the way that children's voices are when they haven't learned yet to dress their feelings in adult language. "He wasn't biting me," Mason said quietly. "He was holding me." Atlas remained completely still beneath the child's embrace, warm and steady, the way he had always been. He did not pull away. He did not stiffen. He simply accepted the boy's weight against him and stayed. Grady said, "I'm sorry." One more time, looking at Emily, and this time the words carried everything that the first apology had been building toward. Emily felt something shift inside her chest, not a sudden dramatic release but something quieter and more complete, like a knot that had been pulled tight for weeks simply letting go. She nodded once, that was enough. Atlas turned and licked Mason's hand softly, one single gentle gesture, and Mason laughed, a small surprised laugh that rose up naturally from somewhere uncomplicated in him. It wasn't resolution tied up neatly with string. It was just 2 people and a dog on a warm afternoon, letting truth do what fear had prevented for too long. Humility had arrived quietly, and it had begun to heal what pride had damaged. The afternoon light at 418 Willowbrook Drive fell the way it always did in June, coming over the top of the old oak tree in the backyard and spreading across the grass in long golden sheets that made everything look gentler than it was. The wind chimes that Claire Collins had hung from the oak's lowest branch years ago turned slowly in the warm breeze, producing their soft, uneven music. Not a melody exactly, more like a reminder that some things remain even after the people who placed them there are gone. Emily came through the back gate with Atlas walking close beside her, his gait easy now, unhurried, carrying none of the tension that had lived in his body during the weeks of confinement. He moved the way he had always moved in this yard, like someone returning to a place they belong, She sat down beneath the oak tree and leaned her back against its wide, familiar trunk. The bark was rough against her shirt, solid and real in the way that old trees are solid and real, as if they have absorbed enough years to become permanent. Atlas lay down beside her immediately, his head resting across her leg, his eyes half closed in the afternoon warmth. His fur still carried the faintest trace of smoke despite the baths, a ghost of what he had walked through, fading slowly but not yet entirely gone. Emily ran her fingers through the fur along his neck and said nothing for a long time. She didn't need to. The yard was quiet except for the chimes and the distant sound of a lawnmower somewhere down the block, and the quiet felt different from the quiet of the past weeks. It felt like peace rather than absence. She had been thinking, on the drive home and in the minutes since, about what her mother had said in that hospital room 3 years ago. The words had been so simple, spoken in that fragile voice that was already becoming smaller toward the end, almost too simple to carry the weight they had ended up carrying. No matter what happens, Atlas will always protect you. Emily had held on to that sentence for 3 years, the way you hold on to something you are afraid to examine too closely in case examining it breaks it. She had understood the promise as being about her safety, her grief, her loneliness, the particular shape of the hole that Claire's death had left in her world. Atlas was her protector. Atlas was her mother's last gift. That was the promise, and for 3 years that was how she had kept it. But sitting beneath the oak tree in the June afternoon with his warm weight across her leg, she understood something she had not understood before. At Lincoln Park, Atlas had not protected her. Emily had not been in danger that day. He had protected Mason, a child he had no bond with, a boy he had never met, whose safety had no bearing on his own survival or comfort. At the shelter, Atlas had not protected her. Emily had not been inside that building. He had protected Dana Reyes, a woman who had been part of the institution that confined him, who had done nothing for him that might have earned his loyalty. He had also turned back for 2 small dogs locked in a kennel who were strangers to him in every measurable way. He had been free. The exit had been open, and he had gone back into the smoke anyway, not because someone commanded it, not because of training or reward or the language of obligation. He had gone back because something in him could not leave a living thing behind when he had the capacity to help. That was not a learned behavior. That was a nature. That was who he was at his deepest level, in the moment when every instinct for self-preservation was telling him to run. And Emily finally understood that her mother had not simply promised her a protector. Her mother had recognized something in Atlas that was bigger than their family, bigger than their grief, bigger than the particular story of 1 girl and 1 dog in the woods. Claire had seen an animal whose love was not exclusive or selective, whose courage did not require a relationship to activate. She had entrusted Emily not with a guardian but with a reminder that there are beings in this world whose goodness operates without condition, and that being near that kind of goodness changes you over time. Emily pressed her palm flat against Atlas's side and felt the steady rise and fall of his breathing. "Mom," she said softly, not loudly, not as a prayer exactly, just as a word offered to the afternoon air and the chimes, and the memory of someone who had known more than she'd had time to explain. He kept his promise. The chimes moved gently in the breeze. The oak leaves shifted above her, scattering light. Atlas lifted his head just slightly and looked at her face with those calm, dark eyes, and then rested his chin back down on her leg, warm and still and entirely present. Emily closed her own eyes and leaned back against the tree, and for the first time since June 3rd, her chest felt open rather than tight. He had not just protected her. He had become the living proof of what her mother had believed, that love, real love. The kind that acts without asking permission, does not end. It simply finds new ways to continue.